All right, we're going to look at sculpt layers and why they're good, bad, and why you may or may not want to use them. All right, so as I add a new sculpt layer, the cool thing about sculpt layers is that let's just kind of drag across the surface here and add some details. All right, let's move around a little bit, do a little more here. Really kind of push this surface. So let's crank up our strength a little more. Really start to push that around. All right, now the cool thing about sculpt layers is that I've got a strength setting. So as I drag the strength for that sculpt layer, I can decrease its influence over the mesh. So let's crank that back up to 100. Now let's say I just don't like the actual amount of detail I have here and I want to subdivide. So as I subdivide, you see the sculpt layer is no longer actually available for me to sculpt on. So it says there, right? The sculpt layer is locked and only available at the mesh subdivision level that it's actually been created at. So if I want to use another sculpt layer, I've got to subdivide to the level that we want to work at, and then we'll add a new sculpt layer. So now to work on this layer, let's maybe try imprint on this layer. And we'll crank up the strength a little bit more so we get a nice deep imprint. Very deep imprint. And then let's look at again adjusting its strength. So I can bring its strength back down to a point where it's actually a bit more acceptable. And then let's look at imprinting again with something a little bit lighter. But the detail still needs to be increased, because I'm getting a pretty rough approximation of what that imprint brush really does look like. So it's just not enough detail, so let's subdivide again. So now at about 1.6 million polys, we'll get a much better result. Oh, but again, since I'm not at that sculpt layer, I can't work on it. So I need to add a new sculpt layer that I can then add to. So that's both the good and bad, in my opinion, of sculpt layers. As I add new detail to the mesh, I have to continually add new sculpt layers. Now, another cool thing about sculpt layers is that I can actually erase from that sculpt layer and kind of fine-tune exactly what that sculpt layer is doing. So in a lot of ways, sculpt layers have some benefits, but also some drawbacks. So whether or not you use sculpt layers is dependent on the way you like to work and probably the project that you're working on. So I don't tend to use sculpt layers a lot just because I find that I always want that detail to be available to me. But the cool thing is, right as I page back down, now I can actually adjust the detail or the strength of that sculpt layer, and it pushes back up under the other parts of my object. So we back down to sculpt layer 4, and let's say I want to bring that down a little bit. And then we'll page back up to sculpt layer 3 or level 8. And as I move around the object, I see that the detail that was on sculpt layer 1 is actually minimized underneath. So there are definitely in the long run some benefits, and again, like I said, some drawbacks to using sculpt layers. Now, depending on your workflow method, you can definitely utilize sculpt layers very effectively. You do kind of the big detail or the big soft detail work at lower subdivision levels and lower sculpt layers. And then as you add the finer details at higher sculpt layers and higher subdivision levels, you'll be able to go back below and adjust the amount that the kind of big picture soft details are being added into the mesh. So there's definitely effective ways to use sculpt layers. Just kind of understand the fact that as you change subdivision levels or add subdivisions to your mesh, the sculpt layers are only available to work on at the subdivision level where it was created.